Under the corrosive hiss of acid rain, the outer walls of Fortress Cipher gleamed a sickly green, their armor plating pitted from years of unrelenting storms. The night was meant to be quiet. Shift changes, routine scans, the hum of automated turrets. But then a sharp, unnatural light cut through the downpour. A blue-green flare pulsing against the clouds blinked like a heartbeat. It wasn't the color of distress signals used by human colonies, but it carried the rhythm, familiar enough to stir hope. From the east tower, Corporal Dreven squinted through rain-smeared optics. "Possible survivors, Sector 7, he called into his comm. The watch officer leaned over the console, saw the flicker, and without waiting for full confirmation, ordered the gate to cycle. Heavy hydraulics groaned. Armor plates split. The storm roared in. The first shadow burst through before the gate was halfway open, an insectoid, its carapace glistening under the acid rain. Mandibles clicking in anticipation. Then another, and another, until the entry corridor became a river of chitin and serrated limbs. The soldiers had time to fire a single volley before the swarm hit. The air filled with the clang of claws against exosuit plating, the wet crunch of flesh yielding under talons, the shrieks of men being dragged into the mass. The turrets spun and fired blindly, plasma bolts flashing in the rain. But the insectoids moved like a tide, climbing over each other, over corpses, unstoppable. Dreven fell back, firing until his rifle's charge pack whined empty. Sergeant Halden tried to seal the inner blast door, but an alpha drone leapt through the gap, tearing his arm off before the seal could engage. The floor became a slick film of blood and rainwater, reflecting the wild dance of emergency strobes. Then, as suddenly as it began, the killing stopped. Through the arch of the still open gate, a figure emerged, framed by the storm. She walked slowly, unhurried, her boots splashing in the mingled red and black runoff. Her cloak, the deep green of polished jade, clung to her frame in the rain. Beneath the hood, her eyes were shadowed, unreadable. She did not carry a weapon. In her right hand was a small glass vial, its contents glowing faintly blue, swirling as if alive. The insectoids parted for her. Those closest to the corpses stepped back, lowering their bodies until their claws touched the ground. A sound rose from them, not the war cry that had shattered the fortress minutes ago, but a low, resonant hum, vibrating in the chest more than the ears, a ritual sound, synchronized as if each creature shared the same thought. She stopped beside the largest pool of blood, uncorked the vial, and let a single drop fall. The scent was impossible to name, metallic, sweet, and sharp all at once. Every insectoid froze. Then, as if pulled by an invisible hand, they all lowered themselves further. Chitin scraping against stone, heads bowed. The hum deepened into a single note of submission. In the corner of the courtyard, Dreven stumbled to his feet. His armor was cracked, his visor shattered, but his sidearm was still in his grip. He raised it, hands trembling, sighting down at the hooded figure. The movement was enough to draw the gaze of the swarm. Dozens of eyes, faceted, black as oil, locked on him. Claws shifted, legs tensed. She turned toward him, her face still half hidden by the hood. "You're alive," she said, her voice calm against the rain's hiss, "because I haven't told them otherwise." His finger tightened on the trigger, but the words sank in like cold iron. One wrong twitch, and the swarm would move faster than he could blink. She walked past him without hurry, the swarm flowing with her, their legs clicking in perfect rhythm. They moved as one body, one will hers. Dreven's comm crackled, a survivor from the north wall shouting for reinforcements, but his voice faltered when he looked over and saw the impossible, the creatures leaving, not retreating in fear, following her like a disciplined army. The glow of the vial dimmed as she tucked it back beneath her cloak. Lightning flashed, illuminating her profile for a moment. Sharp cheekbones, rain-slicked lips, eyes that seemed both human and alien in their stillness. Behind her, Fortress Cipher burned. Plasma conduits ruptured during the assault were spilling fire into the acid rain, sending gouts of steam into the black sky. The screams of the wounded mixed with the hiss of collapsing metal. She paused at the threshold, the swarm clustering close. The Alpha drone, the same that had torn Halden apart, stepped beside her, towering over her by two heads, its clawed limb hanging at rest like a dog's leash held slack. She looked back once, just enough for her voice to carry across the courtyard. "They'll tell you I came to destroy you," she said. "But you'll wonder why I left you breathing." Then she turned away, the swarm pouring after her into the darkness beyond the walls. Dreven stood frozen, his pistol hanging useless at his side. The acid rain hissed on his armor, cooling the blood that had splashed there. Somewhere beyond the ruined perimeter, the blue-green glow appeared again, faint, pulsing, moving east, toward something, toward somewhere. Hours later, when reinforcements arrived to find Zypher's gate shattered in half, its garrison dead, rumors had already begun. No one agreed on what she was, a renegade, a warlord, a witch, but every account shared one detail. She was leading the swarm, not away from the war, but toward its heart. And someone whispered the part that chilled them most. She's taking them to a place even more important than Zypher. On the fringes of known space, where storms flayed the land, and the air stank of metal and decay, there had once been a village, a cluster of domed huts clinging stubbornly to the brittle soil of a border moon. Ariana Val had called it home. She had been a herbalist then, tending to moss gardens and bioluminescent fungi, brewing curatives for fevers that came with the rains. She had no weapon, no armor, just the patient hands of someone who healed rather than harmed. That life ended in one night. The war had been distant thunder until the day the council ordered the evacuation corridors sealed. A swarm of insectoids was advancing, too large to stop. The council needed time to reinforce the fortress worlds, and her moon was chosen as the delay. They promised protection, but the gunships never landed. Instead, she watched from the ridge as the blockade ships turned away, leaving the swarm to fall upon the settlement. Her parents were among the first to die, her younger brother dragged screaming into the chittering mass. That night, as the sky burned green with the reflected fire of the swarm's advance, she learned the truth. The council would sacrifice anyone to buy a handful of hours. She had run, but not far enough. The insectoids captured her in the chaos, their clawed limbs wrapping around her like iron bands. She expected death. Instead, she was taken deep into the nest, through tunnels slick with resin and shadows. The air was thick with a scent so alien it clawed at the back of her throat, acrid, sharp, layered with hidden meanings she could not yet understand. It was there, in the pulse-lit heart of the hive, that she met the queen. The great matriarch was dying, her chitin dulled, her movements sluggish. A parasitic growth, Cerathis bloom, had sprouted along her thorax, its faintly glowing spores leeching her strength. To the insectoids, the bloom was a blight. To Ariana, it was a revelation. She recognized its patterns instantly, similar to the spore cluster she had studied, but carrying properties she had only seen in fragmented research from the old biowarfare archives. It was more than a parasite. It was a key. When she signaled that she could help, the drones parted. They gave her tools, crude but serviceable. She cut away the necrotic growth, harvested the bloom in careful pieces, and brewed a tincture from its spores. She learned quickly that the bloom exuded compounds that interfered with insectoid neural pathways. Simple exposure could dull aggression, concentrated doses could override their instinct entirely. She didn't just save the queen's life, she altered the balance between human and insectoid forever, though only she knew it. In gratitude or perhaps calculation, the queen taught her the pheromonal language of the swarm. It was not words, but an intricate code of sense, chemical pulses that carried command, warning, allegiance. Days became weeks, and she began to think in those scents, to understand the rhythm of their society. The hierarchy etched in smell, the currents of obedience that flowed from queen to drone. When she was released back to human space, she was no longer the herbalist who had once feared the chitter of claws in the dark. She carried vials of the bloom's essence, each one capable of bending an insectoid's will. She carried the language of the swarm in her mind, and she carried a hatred that burned in two directions. The council had abandoned her family. The swarm had slaughtered them. Neither deserved her loyalty. Outwardly she was calm, almost serene. She could sit for hours grinding dried spores into fine powder, her movements steady, her breathing slow. But beneath that stillness was a coiled wire of intent, an unbroken thread of rage. She did not speak of vengeance. She simply prepared for it. The chance came when she overheard two smugglers in a backwater cantina speaking of the Rebirth Core. The words meant nothing to them, just another piece of tech locked behind the fortress walls of Zypher. But she knew the rumors. The core was a relic from before the collapse, a seed machine capable of terraforming a dead world in weeks. In the right hands, it could restore life to a dozen shattered colonies. In the wrong hands, it would be a bargaining chip to hold entire systems hostage. And the council's hands were the wrong ones. She asked no questions of the smugglers. She left before they even noticed her. That night, in a makeshift laboratory carved into the side of a canyon wall, she laid out her vials. Each shimmered faintly in the low light, blue and green and violet. She set to work, brewing a strain of the bloom's essence so potent it would not merely compel obedience, it would lock the command into the creature's mind until death. The scent would mark her as alpha. The swarm would follow her into fire, into plasma, into the heart of the enemy. When she was done, she corked the vial and held it up to the light. Tiny motes drifted inside, slow and deliberate, like the pulse of a living thing. She thought of her parents, her brother, the smoldering ruins of her village. She thought of the council chambers, all polished steel and glass, where men and women in immaculate uniforms decided which worlds to burn for the greater good. Her hands did not tremble. There was no army to recruit, no speeches to give. Her plan was as direct as it was impossible. Find the nearest Alpha brood, seize its mine, and lead it straight to Zypher's gates. The fortress would fall, the core would be hers, and the council would learn what it was to be powerless. In the mirror of polished metal above her workbench, her own gaze met hers, steady, cold, unblinking. She could almost hear the queen's voice again, low and resonant in the darkness of the hive. The one who commands the scent commands the swarm. She capped the vial and slipped it into the hidden pocket of her cloak. The rain outside hissed against the rock as she stepped into the storm, the air carrying just the faintest trace of the bloom's scent. Somewhere beyond the horizon, claws scraped stone, and mandibles clicked in restless hunger. They would follow her soon enough, and when they did, neither human nor insectoid would stand untouched. The Black Market quarter on Beira Outpost was a maze of rusting stalls and flickering signs, the air thick with ozone and the mingled scents of alien spices and machine oil. Ariana moved through it like a shadow, her jade cloak drawn close, the hood hiding her features. Every step was measured, every glance deliberate. She had come for rare reagents, volatile catalysts to refine the Seraphis, bloom into its most potent form. Without them, her elixir would be useless against the alpha brood she planned to command. Word traveled faster than she did. By the time she reached the inner market, whispers had already preceded her. The woman in green, the one who walks with the swarm. Faces turned, conversations faltered. Some merchants backed into the shadows rather than meet her gaze. Others watched her like they were memorizing every detail for the highest bidder. Somewhere above the din, a bounty board updated in real time, the numbers beside her name climbing to a sum large enough to buy an entire border station. The council was done pretending she didn't exist. She ignored the stares, slipping between stalls stacked with jars of desiccated roots and crates of glistening alien organs. The market's chaos was a shield until it wasn't. She felt the shift before she saw it, the way the crowd's noise dipped, the way bodies leaned just slightly aside to make room for something or someone coming toward her. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of plain travel coat that didn't fool anyone. The weight of his sidearm showed in the way his hip moved. His eyes were fixed on her, unblinking. He closed the distance with slow, deliberate steps, one hand hidden in his coat. She didn't break stride. The air around her carried a faint sweetness barely noticeable to humans, almost masked by the market smells. But to someone stepping within its reach, it was a net tightening. The moment he came close enough to speak, she saw the twitch in his jaw, the glassiness in his eyes. The toxin worked fast. His voice caught halfway through whatever threat he'd planned. "You're..." His knees buckled, his coat shifting to reveal the polished grip of a plasma pistol. She caught his wrist before the weapon hit the ground, twisting it free with surgical precision. He collapsed against a stack of crates, breathing shallowly, pupils dilated. A merchant 2 stalls over looked up sharply but said nothing. In the black market, silence was currency. Ariana crouched beside the man, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "They should have sent someone immune to perfume." She slipped the pistol into her cloak, stood, and melted back into the flow of the crowd, leaving him conscious but paralyzed. By the time he could move again, she would be long gone. She found the reagent she needed at a cramped stall run by a wiry old trader with skin like folded parchment. He studied her for a long moment before speaking, his voice rasping like metal dragged on stone. "Haven't seen you here in years. Thought you'd died." "I was busy," she replied, inspecting the sealed vials lying neatly on his counter. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, the rare catalyst from the deep fungal veins of Baryon 4. Exactly what she needed. The old man leaned in, his breath smelling faintly of alkaloid smoke. "You know what's happening outside these walls. The council doesn't fear the swarm. They've fought them for decades. But you," his eyes narrowed, "they fear you, because you can do something they can't control." Her fingers paused on the vial. She met his gaze, saying nothing. "They put hunters in exosuits on your trail," he went on. "One's built for the deep hive. They won't stop. They can't. The bounty's too high." She counted out payment in old silver credits, their edges worn smooth. "Then I won't give them time to find me." That was the end of the conversation. She slipped away into the alleys, the rain beginning to fall again, hissing as it met the cracked ferrocrete. Every drop carried the acrid tang of the acid storms. Somewhere above, carrier drones zipped past, their red eyes scanning the streets. By the time the first exosuit squad touched down on Vera, Ariana was already miles away. threading through the canyons east of the outpost. Her mind was set on the next step. If the council wanted to corner her, she would strike before they could tighten the noose. She would take the swarm, not a fragment, but an entire brood, and hurl it against Zypher's gates before the council could reinforce them. The brood she sought was dangerous, even to her. It nested in a geothermal cavern network, deep in territory where no human settlement survived more than a season. She knew the risks, alphas that might resist her elixir, drones conditioned to turn on anything that smelled foreign. But waiting was more dangerous. Every day gave the council more time to prepare, more time to build weapons meant for her instead of the swarm. She stopped at the canyon's edge, drawing her cloak tighter as the wind shifted. From here, she could smell it, a faint alien musk on the air, carried from miles away. The brood was close. The scent curled in her mind, familiar yet edged with danger. Like a blade she knew how to wield, but could still cut her. She reached into her cloak and touched the smooth glass of the elixir vial. It pulsed faintly in the dim light, as if aware of what was coming. Her plan was simple in words, impossible in execution. Enter the brood's domain, seed the air with the elixir, break the alpha's will, and bind the swarm to her. Once they were hers, they would move as one, unstoppable, unquestioning, a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the council's power. The rain intensified, drumming on the canyon walls. She began the descent, each step a reminder that there would be no retreat if the elixir failed. Somewhere below, thousands of clawed feet shifted in restless anticipation. Somewhere in the dark, the alpha was waiting, and it did not yet know its fate. The air in the geothermal canyon shimmered with heat, steam rising from fissures in the rock as if the earth itself were exhaling. Ariana stood at the mouth of the brood's cavern, the glass vial of Miracle in her hand. Go! The pale green liquid swirling in hypnotic currents. Her pulse was steady, her breathing measured, though she knew that within minutes there would be no room for calm. One flick of her wrist and she uncorked the vial, the scent bursting into the air, a layered chord of chemical notes. That slithered through the steam and down into the tunnels. The reaction was immediate. From the darkness came the sound of claws on stone, at first faint, then building to a rumble like distant thunder. Shadows moved within shadows. Then the first insectoid emerged, its armor plates glinting in the fractured light, mandibles opening to release a hiss that resonated in Ariana's chest. Behind it came dozens more, then hundreds, pouring from the tunnels like a living river, their bodies weaving over one another in a seamless, writhing current. They flowed toward her, not in attack, but in alignment, their antennae angled toward the scent she carried. Ariana stepped back into the canyon floor, letting them surround her. The ground seemed to vibrate with their mass. Above the roar of their movement, another sound broke through, a sharp whine of thrusters. She looked up to see shapes descending from the ridge. Sleek, black-armored figures dropped into position, exoshoot troopers bristling with mounted plasma cannons. The council had moved faster than she anticipated. But target is confirmed, came the metallic voice of the squad commander over amplified speakers. Engage. Bolts of plasma lit the canyon, scorching the rock, the air stinking of ozone and charred chitin. The swarm reacted instantly, turning toward the new threat. But Ariana's voice cut through the chaos-sharp commands in the pheromone language, amplified by the Miracle's hold. The insectoids surged forward, meeting the exosuits head-on. From the commander's channel came a barked order. Halt! Fire on swarm! Take the controller alive, a soldier's voice answered, strained. If she goes down, the swarm turns on all of us. That's an order! They came at her in a coordinated pincer, their thrusters kicking up clouds of dust and steam. Ariana backed toward the canyon wall, mind racing. The swarm was holding the front, but she had no guard on her rear flank. That was when she heard it, the deeper, heavier cadence of something larger moving through the steam. She turned just in time to see the alphas, towering insectoids, their armor darker, their movements sharper, and, most importantly, utterly unmoved by the scent of Miracle. Her hold over the brood meant nothing to them. The first alpha lunged, its claws smashing into the stone where she had stood a moment before. She rolled aside, the impact sending shards flying, and felt the burn in her shoulder as something hot seared through it. She hit the ground hard, breath hissing between her teeth. Above her, a council trooper had taken the shot, plasma round grazing her instead of killing her outright. The jolt made her grip falter. The vial of Cerathis bloom slipped from her fingers, spinning once in the dim light before dropping into the churned mud at her feet. She saw it fall, saw the precious glow dim as it rolled toward the edge of a fissure. Another alpha came from the side, claws snapping inches from her head. She dove for the vial, hand sinking into the cold, slick mud. The chittering around her rose to a frenzy. The front line was holding for now, but the Alphas were pushing through, and the exosuits were exploiting the gaps. A shadow passed over her as one of the Alphas reared back, both forelimbs raised to crush her. Her fingers closed around the vial just as the shadow descended. She rolled again, the Alpha's claws smashing into the mud where her head had been, sending up a spray of dirt and spores. She jammed the vial back into its secure slot beneath her cloak, ignoring the stab of pain from her injured shoulder. Around her, the battlefield was collapsing into chaos. The swarm's front ranks were buckling under sustained plasma fire, the exosuits pressing their advantage. 2 troopers broke through the line, their armor scorched but intact, moving with surgical precision toward her. She let them get close enough to see her eyes before she reached into her cloak with her uninjured arm and snapped open a small ampoule of concentrated miracle. The scent burst into the air in a wave, and the non-alpha insectoid went mad. The swarm turned as one, abandoning the exosuits in the front lines to hurl themselves at the intruders near their queen figure. The troopers vanished beneath a mass of claws and mandibles, their screams drowned in the insectile roar. The Alphas hesitated, momentarily thrown by the shift in battlefield dynamics, and Ariana used the gap to move toward the canyon's edge. But every step sent fire through her wounded shoulder, and she could feel the weight of what she had lost. Not the vial. She still had that, but nearly all of the auxiliary doses she had brought. Between the fight with the Alphas and the desperate gambit to repel the troopers, she had burned through most of her miracle reserves. The commando's voice echoed again, this time closer. "You can't hold them forever, Val. When that scent runs out, they'll tear you apart first." She didn't bother to answer. She reached the ridge path, the swarm forming a protective wall behind her. Alphas pacing at the periphery like wolves unwilling to cross an invisible line. Her breath came ragged, not from fear, but from the weight of calculation. She had won the field, but only barely. The Council's exosuits had been forced to retreat, but the Alphas had proven the limits of her control. Gee! By the time the steam swallowed her and the swarm, the canyon floor was littered with shattered exosuit plating and insectoid corpses. The Miracle's scent still lingered, faint and fading, but she knew exactly how much she had left. Enough for one push, one decisive strike. She let the swarm flow around her, their movements slower now, the exhaustion of battle settling into their limbs. The injured limped. The dead were left behind without ceremony. The Alphas followed at a distance, watching her with those unreadable black eyes, neither hostile nor submissive, waiting, perhaps, for her to falter. She didn't. She couldn't. Clutching her injured arm close, she pressed forward into the tunnels that would take her closer to Zypher. Every drop of elixir counted now. Every step brought her closer to the point where there would be no retreat. And as the heat and shadows closed in, she understood something with cold clarity. The next battle would decide everything, because she only had enough control left for one more war. The night sky over Fortress Zypher burned with streaks of plasma fire, each bolt a lance of white-hot energy tearing through the acid mist. From the ground, the air was alive with thunder, the shock waves of the fortress's cannons rattling the stone beneath Ariana's boots. Every burst of light cast the swarm into stark relief on the walls. Thousands of insectoid bodies surging forward, their limbs clawing for purchase on the ferrocrete, their black carapaces gleaming like a tide of oil. From the ramparts, the defenders saw not an army, but a nightmare crawling toward them, each flash of plasma revealing more than they wanted to believe. She was at the heart of it, the swarm flowing around her like a living storm. The Myrkul still clung to the air, barely holding the majority of the brood in its grip, but she could feel the control fraying. The Alphas had found them. She could hear their deep, rasping calls cutting through the chaos orders to turn, to kill anything within reach, even their own kind. And the soldiers on the walls were exploiting every gap, raining fire on the faltering lines. An Alpha smashed into the flank of the formation, its claws cleaving through drones that moments ago had obeyed her without hesitation. Panic rippled through the ranks. The front lines staggered, giving the fortress's gunners an opening. Plasma blasts ripped into the swarm, vaporizing creatures in bursts of green flame. Ariana barked commands in the pheromone language, pouring every drop of authority into her voice. But the Alphas ignored her, their will too strong to bend without something far more potent. From above, a voice boomed over the fortress loudspeakers, cutting through the din. "You will die with them, witch," the garrison officer roared. "Your pets can't save you." She looked up, finding the speaker in the glare of cannon fire, a man in polished battle armor, his face barely visible behind the glow of his visor. Her voice carried back, low but sharp enough to pierce the chaos. "If I die," she said, "it will be after you're on your knees begging for mercy." The officer laughed, A harsh, tinny sound over the comms and signaled the next volley. The plasma fire intensified, hammering the swarm, and the Alphas pushed harder into the chaos, ripping apart drones, driving them into disarray. Ariana's mind was a knife's edge between calculation and fury. The walls would not fall at this rate. Zypher's gates were built to withstand siege tanks. Only the full, suicidal force of the swarm could break them. Her hand slipped into her cloak, fingers finding the vial of concentrated Cerathis bloom, the last of her reserves, stronger than anything she had dared use before. She had made it for one purpose, to shatter an Alpha's mind completely. But here, among so many, it would do more than that. It would rip through the brood like fire through dry grass, burning away resistance, obliterating instinct, leaving only a single blinding compulsion: destroy. The cost was obvious. The neural damage would be irreversible. Any drone that survived would be little more than a husk. Her thumb rested on the vial's seal. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. The Meyer call was already failing. The Alphas were slaughtering her front lines, and the fortress gunners showed no sign of slowing. She saw the swarm through the defenders' eyes. Monsters at the walls, a terror to be erased. But she also saw them as she had in the hive's depths, the glint of awareness in an Alpha's gaze. The way they had learned to recognize her scent, the way they had followed her through storms and battle. Allies in their own alien way. The thought cut deep. Am I saving humanity or becoming the thing they fear most? Another Alpha's roar broke the moment. It crashed into the swarm only meters from her, its claws sweeping drones aside like leaves. A bolt of plasma sizzled past her head so close she felt the heat. Her choice was gone. She broke the seal. The scent burst into the air, heavy and intoxicating, rolling out in a wave that cut through the acrid mist and the stink of battle. The reaction was instantaneous. Every drone within range froze, antennae snapping upright, eyes dilating. Then they moved. Faster, harder, with no thought for their own survival. The swarm slammed into the gates in a single convulsive surge, their bodies stacking against the ferrocrete as more climbed over them. Alphas fought the pull, shrieking in rage, but even they faltered as the compound invaded their minds, muddling their commands, sending jagged impulses through their nervous systems. The fortress walls shook. Steel groaned. The defenders poured fire into the mass, but it only drove the swarm harder. Claws tore at seams in the gate, mandibles biting into armor plating, limbs punching through the cracks. In seconds, the once impenetrable barrier was a writhing heap of chitin and metal. The final breach came with a sound like the world breaking, hinges snapping, the gate collapsing inward under the press of alien bodies. Ariana moved with them, the tide carrying her through the shattered entrance. Inside, the fortress was a maelstrom of smoke, steam, and dying light. Drones tore through defensive lines, heedless of injury. Plasma fire hissed in every corridor. She caught glimpses of soldiers falling back, some firing wildly, others dropping weapons and running. But the victory was laced with the taste of ash. The drones that had reached the gate first were already collapsing, their bodies twitching, smoke curling from the joints where neural pathways had burned out. The Alphas that had resisted longest now staggered like drunkards, their eyes dulling. She stepped over one as it fell, its massive frame hitting the ground with a sound that seemed too final. Her boots splashed through pools of blood, black, green, and red, mixing in the same shallow water. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and scorched flesh. Above it all lingered the cloying sweetness of the elixir, the mark of what she had done. Behind her, the fortress officer's voice rose again, ragged now, coming from somewhere deeper within. "You'll burn with them," she turned once, scanning the chaos. "I've already burned," she muttered, too quietly for him to hear, and pressed on toward the inner vaults where the rebirth core was kept. The swarm followed, but it was a shadow of its former self, still deadly, but already fraying at the edges. Drones stumbled, fell behind, or simply stopped, their bodies giving out mid-stride. She knew what awaited them, the inevitable collapse. She had traded their lives for this breach. By the time she reached the central keep, her arm ached from the weight of the vial still in her cloak, a phantom weight now, for it was empty. She had nothing left to give them, no way to guide them once the compulsion burned itself out. They would die in minutes, perhaps less. She forced the thought aside. The gates were down. Zypher was open, and humanity's last hope was within her reach. The cost. The cost would come later. For now, there was only the victory she had carved from blood, fire, and the ruin of those who had followed her without question. The breach had come like a thunderclap, the final collapse of Zypher's gates echoing through the acid-soaked night. The swarm had poured through in a single, brutal wave, thousands of clawed limbs hammering into ferrocrete. mandibles tearing at armor plating, bodies absorbing plasma blasts meant for her. They had smashed the outer barricades, shredded the automated turrets, and crushed the first 3 defensive lines under sheer weight and momentum. It was over in minutes, and yet the cost was written in every inch of ground they'd taken. By the time Ariana crossed the threshold, the swarm was barely holding together. Drones staggered past her, their movements jerky, some collapsing mid-step, their limbs still twitching. The alphas were gone, either brought down in the fighting or finished by the neural damage from the elixir. The air was heavy with the mingled stench of ozone, burnt resin, and blood. The rain had not stopped. It fell in acidic sheets, pattering on chitin and metal alike. Hissing wherever it touched the scorched earth, the liquid ran down the gutters in swirling rivulets of black, green, and red colors blending into one indistinguishable shade under the dim light of the burning walls. She moved through it slowly, her boots slipping on wet stone. Around her lay the bodies of those who had fought, human and insectoid alike, fused together in a sprawl of claws and limbs, armor and shattered weapons. The Miracle's influence had burned away, leaving only silence. The roar of battle was gone, replaced by the distant crackle of fire and the soft hiss of rain. A figure emerged from behind a half-collapsed barricade. A soldier, his exosuit half melted from acid, his visor cracked. He gripped a rifle in both hands, though his stance told her he had no strength left to use it. His eyes met hers through the broken visor, confusion and revulsion mingling there. His voice was hoarse. You're the reason we're still breathing, or the reason we're dying. Which is it? She stopped in front of him, her own voice quiet but edged with something harder than steel. If this world survives long enough to ask that question again, you'll have to answer it yourself. He stared at her for a long moment, then lowered his rifle. Whether it was acceptance, exhaustion, or defeat, she didn't care to guess. Past the wreckage of the main courtyard lay the inner keep. The gates there had been sealed before the outer wall fell, but they had not been built to withstand an army, or what was left of hers. A final cluster of drones had clawed their way through the reinforced doors before their bodies failed. She stepped over them without looking down. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, the storm muted by the thick stone. The light came from a single containment chamber at the far end, its walls alive with shifting patterns of gold and green. The rebirth core. It floated in its field, a perfect sphere of crystalline lattice, humming with the restrained energy of worlds waiting to be born. For a moment, Ariana simply stood there, watching it. This was what the Council had hoarded, what they had deemed too dangerous, too precious to be placed in the hands of anyone they could not control. With this, she could undo the ruin they had allowed to spread. She could rebuild what had been lost, or destroy it entirely if she chose. Her hand hovered over the release mechanism. The silence of the keep pressed in on her, but beneath it, in the back of her mind, she heard the echoes of the swarm's last moments, the thunder of their charge, the hiss of acid blood hitting stone, the rasping death calls of the alphas. They had followed her here without hesitation. They had died for a goal they could not understand. Compelled by a bond she had forced upon them, her fingers closed around the release. The field dissolved, and the core dropped lightly into her palm. It was warm, almost alive, the hum resonating through her bones. She turned away from the chamber, tucking the core into the secure pocket of her cloak, where the last vial of bloom had once rested. Outside, the rain still fell, the fire still burned, but Cypher's guns were silent now. The fortress was hers, though there was little left to claim. She stepped back into the courtyard. The soldier from before was gone, leaving only the dead and the dying. She passed them without slowing. She had no elixir left, no commands to give, no one to follow her out of this place. The last of her allies lay scattered in pieces across the fortress grounds. As she reached the broken gates, she glanced back once. The storm's light caught in the pools of mingled blood, the bodies that even death could not fully separate. She had won. She had the core, and yet the victory felt hollow. The air thick with the absence of the only force that had ever truly obeyed her. The world outside was waiting. Council remnants, fortress garrisons, scavengers who would see the fall of Cypher as an opportunity. She would have to decide what came next, and soon. But as she walked into the rain, she knew one truth with a certainty that made her grip the core tighter. In claiming this victory, she had destroyed the only thing that had ever trusted her without question. They called her many names in the weeks that followed the fall of Cypher, across the shattered belt colonies, in the surviving stations of the core worlds, and in the drifting market hubs where news came as whispers before it became truth, a legend spread. To some, she was a saint, the one who broke the Council's grip, who tore down their walls when no one else dared. Pilgrims in rusted armor carved her likeness into ship bulkheads, burning incense beneath it. To others, she was a demon, The witch who led a tide of monsters to slaughter humans and alien alike. Who wielded life as a leash and death as a convenience. In the gambling dens and militia barracks, her name was spoken as a curse. A story to frighten recruits about the cost of following the wrong leader. The truth lay somewhere between the myth and the accusation, but Ariana Val had no interest in clarifying it. She didn't send messages, didn't offer explanations. The rebirth core was hers, and she had vanished into the outer dark before the Council's fractured remnants could marshal a counterstrike. Yet traces of her remained, and they kept the legend alive. A burned-out listening post on the rim carried a fragment of her voice in a scrambled transmission, later pieced together by smugglers. It was not a rallying cry or a threat, just words, steady and deliberate. The tone of someone leaving behind a warning more than a legacy. Power is not for holding everything. Power is for choosing what is worth holding. If victory demands that you betray the one who trusted you most, you must be certain the reason is worth it. The message spread like a contagion, carried by traitors, hackers, and deserters. It appeared on walls in deep space ports, scratched into the paint of cargo containers, etched on the inside panels of shuttle cockpits. Some took it as wisdom, others as a veiled confession. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, the story grew teeth. People swore they had seen her, on a refueling dock on the Eris Fringe, in the underlevels of Vera Outpost, in the ruins of an old listening array near the dead moon of Celthis. In each account, she was always alone, always moving, the jade cloak still heavy on her shoulders. No one ever mentioned the swarm. Those who had lived through Cypher knew better than to ask. For Ariana, the silence was deliberate. The rebirth core sat sealed in a containment case. Its hum, a constant reminder that she now held the means to shape worlds or unmake them. But her hand often drifted to another weight in her cloak, the last vial of elixir. It glimmered faintly when she uncorked it to check the seal, a living memory of everything she had done to reach this point. One dose, enough to bend a single will, perhaps an alpha's, perhaps something else entirely. Enough to start again, if she chose to walk that path. She thought often of the swarm in those quiet stretches between jumps. The alphas who had watched her with wary recognition, the drones who had fought and died in blind devotion. The strange rhythm they had moved in when fully under her control. She told herself they had been tools, nothing more. But the memory of the last charge at Cypher clung to her, a living wall of chitin and claws, tearing themselves apart to bring her to the gates, and the way they had collapsed one by one while she stepped over them with the core in her grasp. The galaxy called her the Brood Keeper, the Swarm Witch, the one who commanded the tide. She called herself nothing at all. Some nights, in the dim hum of the ship's cabin, she would whisper into the dark, not to the dead, not to the living, but to whatever space lay between. If the choice came again, she murmured once, fingers resting on the vial, would I find another way? Or would I still burn it all? The ship gave no answer. On the far edge of the map, where star charts turned to blank canvas, she found a world. No name, no registered outpost. The scans showed oceans rimmed with deep green continents, the atmosphere rich enough to breathe, the kind of place the rebirth core could remake into something stronger than the Council's vision of order. She stood at the viewport for hours, watching the planet turn in silence. The choice loomed, the same as it had at Cypher. This time there was no swarm, no enemy at the gates, only her, the core, and the ghost of 1,000 chittering voices. The vial in her pocket seemed heavier than the core itself. She turned away from the viewport, locking both objects in their cases. Not yet. The galaxy was still watching, still whispering, and she understood now that the story mattered almost as much as the act. Legends could topple governments, spark uprisings, bend the will of worlds without firing a shot. Her disappearance was not an escape. It was a seed, planted deep, left to grow in rumor and fear. Somewhere in the drift between stars, she left one final transmission. No coordinates, no sender ID, just her voice, stripped of disguise. If to save the world, you must destroy the only ally who ever saved you. Will you do it? No one knew who it was meant for. Maybe it was for the rebels building in secret on the rim. Maybe it was for the fractured council still hunting shadows. Maybe it was for whoever found the core after her. When the message ended, she was already gone. The ship's drives flared once, disappearing into the fold between systems. The planet she had watched from orbit shrank to a speck and vanished from sight. In the empty cabin, the containment case holding the rebirth core sat quiet in its cradle. Beside it, in a smaller compartment, the last vial of elixir rested under a strip of cloth. The liquid within caught the faintest gleam from the console lights, a shimmer like a watchful eye. It waited as if it knew the story was not finished, that one day the tide might rise again.